It's honestly really wild for me to reflect on my life and realize that I'm living the dream life I wrote down in my journal 3 years ago. Word for word. I wrote down that I wanted to live overseas while writing my next book and working for myself full time. And about a year ago, my wife and I moved overseas and we've been living nomadically throughout Europe. And 4 months after our move, I decided to layer on another massive life change and quit my 9-to-5 job and go all in on chasing my dreams of being an author. And I'm currently writing my 4th book. And to actually say that is wild to me, is absolutely wild. But it makes sense because about 10 years ago, I found a way to brainwash myself into believing that I could build my dream life. Not this specific dream, but just the fact that I could build what I want to build and that it could come true. And there were 2 things in particular that helped me get to that place. And the first thing was realizing that we have 2 choices we can make in life. We can either be a pessimist or we can be an optimist. We can have a negative outlook or we can have a positive outlook. I figured if I choose to be a pessimist and choose to have a negative outlook, that's the life I'm going to attract. I'm going to attract low experiences, no opportunities, and I'm just going to be in a bad mood all the time. Or I can choose to be an optimist and I'm going to attract positive experiences. I'm going to see that I could access infinite possibilities and turn my life into whatever I wanted it to be. When I had this realization between being a pessimist and an optimist, the math was pretty easy to me. I was going to be an optimist. I was going to live my life through the lens that anything was possible and that I could build my dream life. And through this, I essentially brainwashed myself to having what some people call a delusional approach to life. But it led me to exactly where I wanted to be. And because I've seen so much proof in my life of optimism always leading me in the right direction, that's just my natural state of being now. I wouldn't be anything other than that because I've already seen how much it's given me. And the other thing that has really helped me alongside optimism is experimentation. I believe that life is this incredible playground and we can experiment with our life and essentially push buttons and see what pops out on the other end. Through this experimentation, we can realize the things that we want to do, the dreams that we have, the things that make us feel good, the things that make us feel fulfilled. And that is something that has helped me get really clear on the life that I'm living. It didn't just come to me one day, I'm like, oh yeah, I want to travel abroad, write a book, quit my job. No, it was through trial and error. It was through figuring out what I liked and didn't like, pushing those buttons and seeing what popped out on the other end. And so I just led with optimism that I could do whatever I wanted and live, quote unquote, the dream life. And then I led with experimentation and experimented with my reality and tried different things and made a mess and made a fool of myself and fell flat on my face and all the things to figure out what the heck I wanted. And it has been the most beautiful experience because it has allowed me to feel like I have a hand in the process of my life and feel like I do have some control over the outcome of my life, even though there are some variables in life that we don't have any control over. But at least I'm kind of co-creating with the world around me to create what I want to create through experimentation. Optimism and experimentation is what led me here. Without those 2 things, I wouldn't be sitting here in Florence, Italy right now talking to you. There's no possible way. And I want to kind of talk about how optimism and experimentation have played out in my entire journey of realizing what my dreams are, realizing what my callings are, answering those callings, and how they led me to here. Because like I said, this wasn't the first dream. This was a dream that evolved over time through many different experiments that I ran. So 13 years ago, I got in a major car accident with a group of my friends during college, and that accident should have taken all of our lives. Like still to this day, I have no idea how we walked away from that accident. But when I look back at that accident and that experience, it is now one of my life's greatest gifts because it was the experience that woke me up and made me understand that we're only given one life. And the way that I was living my life was leading me down a path of regret. I was avoiding the changes I knew I needed to make. I wasn't pursuing life. I was letting it pass me by, and I wasn't living on purpose. I was just going through the motions. And after that experience, I just wanted to change my approach and start living a life that was in alignment with what I dreamed of, so that when my time does come, I don't have any regrets, because I knew that I was pursuing life in an intentional way. And after I graduated college, I decided to go on a 3-month solo backpacking trip to make sense of this experience, make sense of my life, and really connect with who I was, because I was in a place where I was incredibly lost and confused. I didn't know what I wanted, I didn't know who I was, and I wanted to figure out what made me feel alive. As cliche as it sounds, I went on this trip, which was an experiment that I ran because I didn't know what was going to happen after the trip. I just felt called to do it, and it felt fulfilling. And so I went into the experiment with this optimism of anything's possible, and it drastically changed my life. It changed who I was, it changed my understanding of who I was, and it gave me a very clear path of what I wanted to do in the world. I took a journal on that trip, which again was another experiment. I hadn't done any writing in my life up until then. And I thought, what if I take a journal and document everything I'm going through? What will happen if I do that? Let's see, let's run the experiment and see if I like it. I still remember I was in Prague at a hostel in the lobby, and I wrote down, I'm really starting to fall in love with writing, which for me was a crazy sentence to write, because for most of my life I didn't like writing, and I honestly was pretty horrible at it. But I found this new connection of writing through introspection that I really enjoyed. And so when I came back from my trip, not only had I evolved because I was really far outside my comfort zone, but I came back with understanding a new passion of mine, writing and also journaling. And it was journaling that became the thing that led me to understanding what my purpose was. And that was helping other people become the best versions of themselves. And when I came back from that trip, I had a 2-month gap before I started work. And I figured, I want to fill this time really intentionally. What if I tried turning that journal into a book? Another experiment. And so I would surf in the morning, and then I would come home and I would work on this book. And I turned that journal into this passion project called Moment, to Whom It May Concern, which isn't available online anymore. But it was my first time writing for other people, like writing to provide value and as a contribution. And I really connected with how it made me feel. Like it really lit up my heart to write in this way and to be of service. And I thought, it would be really cool for me to write another book one day, like a true self-help book. But, then life started getting fast. I went into the workforce and started in the mortgage industry because I had a finance degree from college. I kind of shelved that idea of wanting to write a book for a bit as I got some money flowing back in my life, because I spent like all my savings on my trip to Europe. It was a self-funded trip, and I was dead broke when I came back. I actually had credit card debt because I learned that I could go over my limit on my trip, which highly do not recommend doing that, but I was in dire need at one point, and so I did it. And so I started working at this mortgage company, and pretty quickly I knew that the mortgage industry was not for me, let alone finance wasn't for me. I knew deep in my heart that I was a creative artist and someone who needed to be doing something creative, or else I feel like I would be just working this like soulless, lifeless job. And one huge realization I had was, if I was going to work the rest of my life, I had to do something that I love. I couldn't just work this job that was unfulfilling and unsatisfying and be okay with that. That wasn't going to fly for me. And I thought to myself, okay, well, what are things that I can do that are fulfilling and creative? And I thought, well, I just fell in love with writing on this trip to Europe. Like, what if I found a way to do that professionally? But I had no journalism background, so I was like, well, I don't know how that's going to happen, but cue the optimism. What if I can make it happen? Anything's possible. Like, what if I could find a way? And so I started to look for ways to make a pivot in my career from finance to the editorial space and do professional writing. And my brother had some freelance clients because he's a writer as well. And he had a client he wasn't working with anymore. And I said, hey, what if I run an experiment to see if I like to do this professionally? Because I think it'd be good for me to see, do I want to turn my passion into something that generates money, or do I just want to keep it a passion? And so I took on one of his clients and started to work on writing articles outside of my 9-to-5. So I'd work in the finance job 9 to 5, come home and write articles for 2 hours. And I did that for a good chunk of time to, one, see if I liked it, and two, build up a portfolio of work that I could show and be like, hey, I can do the job, please hire me. And so through working with this client, I found that I really enjoyed writing. And so I thought, okay, step one of building my dream life is to find a writing job, because that feels like a dream. It was the first time in my life where I had a dream job that I could set my vision on and figure out how to do it. And fortunately, my brother was working at a publication at the time out of New York City, and there was a role that opened at the company on a team that he wasn't on. And so I applied for this job and went through this process, and I wasn't sure if I was going to get it because I had nothing to show on my resume, but I just believed I could do it. I believed it was possible, and so I kept my mind set on that possibility. And I still remember to this day, I was walking around my neighborhood in Los Angeles at the time, and I got the call, and I was like so nervous. I could feel like I had so many butterflies in my stomach, because this was like the first time I ever dreamed of something in my life and really wanted it. I got the job, and they gave me a job as a junior writer, and I was like, yes, like this is the beginning of me building my dream life. I brainwashed myself into thinking it's possible, and now I'm doing it one building block at a time. And so I left the finance world and the mortgage world for good, and I went to the editorial space. But the downside of the job was that I had to take a $30,000 pay cut in my salary. It was a lot for me to grasp, but because I still could pay my bills, I wanted to choose fulfillment over an overflowing bank account, because I knew with time, my pay and everything would catch back up. And it was at a time of my life where I was in my early 20s, and I could take that risk. So I did it. I made the pivot from the finance space to the editorial space, and I started working this writing job. And I still remember my first couple of weeks of work, I was like, oh my God, like I'm doing what I love. I have the chills right now. I'm doing what I love. Like this was my dream job, and I have it, and I was actually enjoying the work. And for the first time in my life, I realized that you can enjoy work. You just have to find the thing that means something to you. And the best way to do that is through experimentation. And while I started to work my writing job, I started to have this dream of wanting to do something for myself. And this is when I kind of felt the seeds of wanting to work for myself full time be planted. But I didn't have a platform yet. I didn't have an audience. I didn't have any products that I was selling. And so I didn't know how I was actually going to make that happen. But cue the optimism, cue the possibility. I knew I could if I believed it was possible. And so I surrendered the how to the universe and just trusted that I could figure out a way to eventually support myself and work for myself full time. And so while I was working this writing job, I had this idea. I was like, hey, I really enjoyed writing that passion project book about my trip to Europe. What if I wrote like a true self-help book? And that was my way of building a platform, an audience, and offering value to the world that could maybe turn into my full-time job one day. That was a big moonshot dream for me, because I was nowhere near at a place in my life to do that. I think at the time on Instagram, I had like 6,000 or 7,000 followers. I had no TikTok account. I just believed I could do it. I figured I could find a way. I could find a way, and let's see what happens if I run this experiment and see if it works out. And so while I was working at this full-time writing job, I started to write my book, which is now out in the world, called You Deserve This Shit. And I worked on that every single morning before work. So I'd wake up, I'd write for about an hour, hour and a half, and then I would work my writing job. It was a lot of writing, but I knew if I could invest this time early on in my life and early on in my career, I could establish a foundation for me to build from and build an even bigger version of my dream life. Not just doing writing for work, but then doing it for myself. And while I was writing my book, You Deserve the Shit, and still working at the New York City publication, my wife and I had this random calling, or I guess it wasn't random, to move from Los Angeles to Seattle. Both of us are from California originally, and so that just felt really out of character for us to kind of move out of the blue. And not to mention, I had never even been to the state of Washington in my entire life. The first time I went up to Washington was to look at the place that we signed a lease for. So we moved from Los Angeles to Seattle at the end of 2020, and right when we got to Seattle, I got headhunted by Forbes, and I was like, holy shit, I never thought I'd be able to work for a company of this size. Obviously, I'm gonna take this job, and so I left the publication I was working at and went to work at Forbes as an editor. That was in December of 2020 that I got that job. About 7 months after I got my job at Forbes, I published my book, You Deserve This Shit, which is my debut self-help book. And I really didn't know what was gonna come from this. I knew that this could be a path to working for myself, but at least I was working at a company and still aligned in a job that felt good. And so I said, you know what? I'm gonna wait until it feels right for me to make the switch. I don't wanna jump early. I wanna make sure when I move from my 9 to 5 to working for myself as an entrepreneur, that it's a good, smart, responsible switch. And so while I'm working at Forbes, I'm doing everything to build up my platform and build an audience. When I first put out You Deserve This Shit, I had less than 10,000 followers on Instagram. I had no TikTok account, so 0 followers on TikTok. And I didn't know how to really market myself. I was still learning what that process was. And so I just took that same optimism and experimentation mentality into growing my book. How could I grow my book in a way that would bring me enough resources to be able to quit my job? It was not an easy journey. For the first 7 months of having my book out, it was like complete crickets. It was 5 to 10 copies per month I was selling. It was not enough to be working full-time for myself. So I kept working this job at Forbes and working this job while I was building up this platform. And then I still remember to this day, December 26, 2021, I woke up the day after Christmas and I had sold over 100 books overnight. And I was like, holy shit, I have never sold that many books. For the very first time, I saw a video of mine with my book in it was going viral on TikTok. As I leaned more into TikTok and just talked more about my book online, the book really started to gain momentum and I was selling more copies than I ever knew was possible. There was a moment where I had sold 1,800 copies in 3 days and 5,000 copies in 1 month and I was floored. But it's all because of the optimism and experimentation. I was just trying different things and believing that at some point something was gonna work, and it did. It did. Something worked and it started to compound, it started to grow. My platform started to grow. I started to gain more followers on Instagram, started to gain more followers on TikTok, but it wasn't enough yet to go full time. While I was working at Forbes and my wife and I were living in Seattle, we kind of got this nudge to want to move overseas, somewhere in Europe. And it was something we had always talked about. I'm a European citizen, I have dual citizenship. And so it's always been kind of in the cards for us to move abroad, but it never really made sense, or it just didn't feel like the right timing. My wife was ready to go like 5 years ago, but I feel like I was always the one hesitating a little bit until it was August of 2024. And I remember having this thought in the shower. I was like, you know, this dream of living overseas is knocking at my door. And if I don't do this, I'm gonna regret not doing it, because it was something we wanted to do before having kids, and that window was getting smaller and smaller. And so I said, you know what, the time is now. And so I still remember going downstairs, we were in the kitchen and we had a conversation and we said, this is definitely going to be something we regret later in life, and that is enough reason to do it. And it was that day that we decided, and within like a few months, we had a massive 2-day garage sale and sold just about everything we owned and then put the rest in storage. And we moved back down to California for the holidays because that's where our families are from. And we stayed there for 3 months. And we moved abroad February 3rd, 2025, which coincidentally is 1 year to the date today. And it was in that moment that the first part of the dream life that I wrote down in my journal came true. And then 4 months after we moved, I was at a place with my book and what I was doing in my work outside of Forbes that it was time to quit. As I was getting closer to when I wanted to quit, which was around May, I could just feel the tension at work growing more and more. The days felt longer, the tasks felt more dreadful, and I just knew that I had to make the leap of faith. And so on May 2nd, 2025, I quit my job at Forbes to go all in on chasing my dreams as an author. And the second that I quit my job, I put writing my book as a priority in my life. And then all of a sudden, I was living the exact dream life that I wrote down in my journal. Live overseas while writing my book and working for myself. It is still crazy for me to repeat that sentence, because when I wrote that down in my journal 3 years ago, I knew it was possible, but I didn't know how it was going to happen. And then now that I'm here experiencing it and I reflect on my life, it is so obvious to me that optimism and experimentation are the things that got me here. And as we think about life and we think about what we want to do or the dream life that you want to build, I would just encourage you to really embrace optimism and experimentation. They're two very, very simple things in life. It's not rocket science. You just need to embrace having a positive perspective, believing that things will work out, and then experimenting with life, trying things, learning about yourself, and taking those two energies and those two approaches and using them as the building blocks of the life that you want to build. I fully believe that you're capable of living the life that you want to build. I fully believe that you can build a dream life as long as you're optimistic, as long as you believe in possibility and be a student of possibility and continuously experiment with life. One thing I do want to say about the experimentation is it doesn't matter if it was a positive experimentation or if it was proven wrong, because you're going to either learn something about yourself that you love to do, or you're going to learn something about yourself that you don't love to do. And so anything that comes out of the experiment is additive to your life, because you can use it as knowledge, like more self-knowledge, to build the life that you truly want to build. Like, for example, early on in my journey, I thought I wanted to be a photographer. And so I experimented with trying to make money doing photography, and I quickly realized that I did not like to make money doing photography because it made me start to hate one of my passions. And so I said, great experiment, taught me a lot, because now I know I can just keep photography as a joy, as something that brings me pleasure and happiness. I don't need to worry about it as a potential idea to explore to make money. And so even though it didn't prove to be the thing to make me money, it showed me that I want to keep this for myself. And so when you start to experiment with life and you find things that you love and you find things that you don't love, see those both as wins, because it's that knowledge that's going to help you build a life that feels really, really aligned. And before I let you go, the last thing I want to encourage you to do is try running some small experiments this week to get a feel of what that life and approach feels like. So maybe you experiment with reaching out to a friend every day, or maybe you experiment with reading a different type of book. Maybe you always read self-help and now you're going to experiment with reading fiction. Or maybe you experiment with going on a run every Friday to end the week. Run really small experiments to get familiar with what it feels like to try something new, and also get familiar with reflecting on how that thing made you feel to inform ways that you can change, adapt, and behave in your life. I will do a much longer in-depth video specifically on experimentation and how you can use it to start your life over or reinvent yourself. And so if that is something that interests you, if you want to reinvent yourself, if you want to build your dream life, and you want to experiment with the things that are happening around you, make sure you subscribe to the channel, because that's going to be coming soon. And I really believe that could be a strong building block of building the exact life that you crave.